Okay, we're all set. All right, so we're going to be back in Matthew chapter 16 this week. If you haven't been with us the last couple weeks, we're working, this is the end this week of a 3-part sermon, and the sermon series is called Walking the Narrow Road. So here's the basics of what you need to know going into this week. Every one of us, as we begin to walk as Christians, as we begin to follow God, as we begin to seek what He has for our lives, we have this understanding that finding God's will for our life is sometimes difficult. This understanding that sometimes we miss the mark. We end up going somewhere where God doesn't want us to go, heading a direction that He doesn't want us to head. And so the question is, well, how do we find God's will for our life? How do we find that road that He has for us? How do we stay on it? And what should that look like? So week 1 of this series was talking about the idea that God's narrow road is first and foremost an invitation into the dark places of the world. The two pieces of that statement: one is that it is an invitation that as God calls us, it is always a path that He lays before us, always a path that we have the option to say no to. And so God never just kind of throws things into our lives. He never forces us into anything. He doesn't bring catastrophes and tragedies into our lives to force us to go a certain direction. When those tragedies occur, He gives us a way out. He says, look, this is how I want to use this. This is where I want you to come and where I want you to go out of this. But we always have the option to say no. It's first and foremost an invitation. And then the second half of that statement is that we are invited into a road that almost always goes somewhere dark. God's roads that He lays before us are rarely clean and easy. The example of that, again, if we take a doctor or a nurse, and if a doctor or a nurse went into work and said to their supervisor, look, can you just give me 1 week where I don't have to work with any sick patients? Give me 1 week where everyone that I work with is healthy, they don't have any broken bones, there's nothing wrong with them, they're pleasant and they're happy and there's nothing to fix. Just give me 1 week of that. We understand that is probably never going to happen because the purpose of a doctor, of a nurse, of a hospital is to care for the sick and for the dying. And in the same way, God's plan for us in our lives is for us to go into those places in the world where people are hurting and broken, those places where things are dark, where there needs the holiness of God. And He calls us to go into those places. Now, the number one example of this is Jesus. And so as we look in Matthew chapter 16, what we have in this passage is Jesus begins to shift in His ministry. First, He physically shifts and starts walking towards Jerusalem, on the road to Jerusalem. And then spiritually, He begins to focus His attention on the cross. And so in this passage, we have Jesus begin to tell the disciples where He's heading. You see, Jesus' narrow road was a path to the cross, where He was crucified, where He was sacrificed to bring forgiveness for the world. And so Jesus, in this passage, begins that journey, begins to share that journey with the disciples. That's what's going on here. And so Jesus' narrow road is a journey to the cross. And so, first of all, we understand that was not a road that was pleasant. It was a road where Jesus was betrayed by one of His best friends. It was a road where he was publicly mocked, where He was beaten, and where He was killed. It was not pleasant. It was not a nice, even, paved, straight road. There were lots of bumps and potholes and curves. So that was our first week. Last week, we talked about, First week was kind of what does the road look like. Last week was, well, how do we stay on the road? How do we stay focused on God's path? How do we make sure we don't get off track? And so we looked at Jesus' example. And in this passage, we see Peter rebuking Jesus for talking about being killed. And Jesus' words to Peter are, "Get behind me, Satan." Remember, the image of that is Jesus is talking to the disciples. He's focused on the cross. He's looking at the cross. All of a sudden, Peter over here distracts him. And his words to Peter are not, stay silent. It's not, be quiet. It's not, stop talking. He says, get behind me. Because Jesus understood one thing that we understand in many parts of our life, and that's that where we're looking is where we go. Whether that's we're driving down the road, and if I'm driving in my car and all of a sudden I'm staring out the window, I will begin to drift in that direction. If we're playing sports and I'm playing baseball and I'm trying to throw the ball straight ahead of me, but my eyes are over here, I will pull that throw in the direction that my eyes look. And so Jesus recognized that in his life, where he focused was where he would end up. And so he knew that it was important to stay focused on the cross so he wouldn't get distracted, so he wouldn't get pulled off track. And so that's what Jesus did. And when he told Peter to get behind him, it was because he knew and he recognized that something that was behind him could not distract him, so he could stay focused on his goal. And so far what we've learned and what we understand is that God calls us to paths that are not easy, that are not simple, that are not clean, and that in order to stay on those paths, we need to stay focused on him. And when we have a person in our life that's distracting to us, who's speaking something to us that's maybe not a direct attack on what we're doing, we talked about how Satan does not attack us directly, how his best option is just to distract us. Because he knows if he can get us just a little bit off track, he knows if he can just pull our gaze a little bit off of Christ, we will eventually begin to swerve. And before we know it, we find ourselves off the road and in the wilderness. And so last week we talked about, well, what are those things in our life, whether it's a person, whether it's a situation, what are those things in our life that distract us and begin to pull us off to the side? This week, our last sermon, we're going to talk about, well, what should this look like at the end? Why? Why is it that God calls us to this, and how should we end up? So let's read our passage to review. This is Matthew chapter 16. We're going to read all of verses 21 through 28, and we're going to focus on verses 24 through 26 later in the message. So verse 21, from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you're a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in glory, in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. God bless your word to us this morning. And so we have this verse that many of us have probably heard or read before. And in verse 25, Jesus says, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So here's where we're going to wrap up this message series. So God calls us to this road. He calls us to work for his kingdom, to go to those who need help, to go to those who are broken, to go into circumstances that are difficult, to rely on his strength to get through it. He calls us to stay focused on him so we can stay in his path. But the question is, why? What is the purpose? What is it supposed to look like? What is the outcome? Where should we end up at the end of all of this? So verse 25 is a verse that I don't know about you, but I've read many, many times. And I think a lot of us, when we read this verse, we try to pretend like we know what it's talking about. But really what's happening is, for me at least, maybe this isn't you, I read the verse a few times, I think about it, I figure out what God wants me to do with it, but we really never figure out why. And here's what I mean by that. We read this verse, again, Jesus said, for whoever would save his life will lose it, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So we read that and we say, all right, I know what you want me to do, God. I can understand that the gist of this verse is that we need to not focus on trying to save our lives ourselves, but we need to allow God to take control, and somehow in the end, we'll end up with something better than we would have had before. We understand that the general gist of this verse is, well, God wants me to rely on him instead of relying on myself, and somehow through that, I'll find the life that I was going to lose. But really, we don't fully understand what's going on. I didn't understand what was going on until I spent a good amount of time in this week, until I kind of diagrammed some stuff out and finally began to make some sense of this verse. So here's what's going on here. Jesus is recapping what he's been saying to the disciples. He begins this passage talking about himself. He begins talking about the narrow road that he's about to go on. But he recognizes at the end that this is also a sermon. This isn't just him talking about himself. This isn't just him saying what's going on with him. He's giving an example to the disciples and to us of what our life is going to look like. And at this point in the passage, he breaks it down. He says, look, all right, here's what's happening. You guys have two options. There's two ways you can go in your life. When you are presented with the gospel, when you are presented with my truth and the things that I want to do in your life, there's two things that you can do. And then he explains them throughout these verses. Here's what he tells us. I'm going to tell you what the two options are, and then we're going to go back and look at them. Your two options are this: the cross and the world. He says everything that you do in your Christian life, everything you do in your relationship with me can be broken down and simplified into these two things. Either you are going to follow me to the cross and you're going to pick up the burden that I have for you to carry, or you're going to reject it and you're going to go another way. And there may be 1,000 paths, there may be 1,000 things you can do in your life, but it really boils down to two. There's the path that God has for you, and then there's everything else. There's a path that God calls you to, this narrow road that he's laid before you, that's his purpose, and that can change as you, this isn't like a one-road thing, and if you miss it, you're done. This is that God always has something for you. He always has a way for you to go to be the person that he wants you to be. And that's one option. The other option is anything else that you choose. Any career, any friend group, any relationship, all of that is just option two if it's not the cross and it's not his path. So then what does that look like? How does that work in this passage? So if we look at verse 25 is in essence a summary of what's happening in verses 24 through 26. Now, what we often do is we look at verse 25 alone and we try to compare it to itself. And so we come up with something like, okay, well, if I try to save my life, I'm going to lose it. But if I lose it, I'm going to find it. I don't know about you, but it just gets confusing and it doesn't make any sense. Take a look up at the screen, though. This is how this passage actually breaks down. Everything in these three verses is interrelated, but it bounces around a little bit. So if you look at verse 25 right in the middle, the beginning of that is Jesus says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. There's your summary. Now what that looks like is shown in verse 26, where he says, what good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And then the second half of verse 25 in blue, whoever loses their life for me will find it. That's your summary. The explanation of that is verse 24, whoever you must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So what Jesus is saying is, look, you've got two options. One of them is to seek to save your own life, to find your own path, to do whatever it is that you want to do. And in so doing, you may gain the world. Maybe your path that you want to choose is that you want to make a lot of money. And hey, you might do that. You might get to the end of your life and have tons of money, and you've got 3 or 4 houses and loads of cars, and your bank account's always full. You never worry about being able to afford everything. But here's what you're going to find out. When you get to the end of your life, you'll begin to realize some things. You'll begin to realize things like you cannot buy friends. How many of you have already figured that out? How many of you have realized that in your life, one of the most valuable things is friends that you can trust to always be there for you? Now, most of us have a handful of people that look like that. I have a few people in my life that I would say are unconditional friends. I've had some experiences in the past year. I've had some people that I was close to that things didn't work out well. I think we all have that from time to time. We have people that man, we begin to get close, and maybe it's circumstantial or whatever it is. Maybe it's somebody that you work with or somebody that you see all the time. But we have relationships that develop, but then all of a sudden they tend to fall apart. And man, the amount of relationships that I have in my life that I know will never fall apart. People that I would consider friends that I know there's nothing that can ever happen to that. That's a short list. One of them is my best friend, Paul. We met here in this church We sat right on that back pew for years and years and years. I've been friends with Paul since the 90s. And he's the kind of friend that we'll go 3 or 4 months without talking, and then we'll talk on the phone, and we'll just talk for 2 hours. And I know that there is basically nothing I could ever do to lose that friendship. But man, you can't buy that stuff, right? You can't manufacture that. I don't care how much money or power you have. That sort of thing doesn't just happen, right? Do we understand that? That like man, all of these things that the world tells us to chase after, they just fall apart at that point. When something bad happens in my life and I want to know that I've got somebody there for me, that's not something that I can get through the wealth of the world. That's not something that I can just manufacture, that I can just create. That doesn't just happen. That the things that God has for me in eternity, none of that comes through all of this other stuff that I can chase. So this is what Jesus is saying. He says, look, if you take your own path, if you try to save what you have, if you try to keep it, if you try to hold on to it, if you try to build up this life for yourself out of your own strength, guess what's going to happen? You might have a good life here on earth. You might have a comfortable life here on earth. But what are you going to do about that which is eternal? Because a life of monetary wealth and personal gain, that doesn't do anything for your soul. It helps your body. You always have good food. You always have nice clothes to put on yourself. You have all this fun stuff you can do. It's good for what's outside. But man, what does that do for what's inside? Because when you were spending 90 hours a week, you weren't spending time with your family. And so what of that do you have left? And when you stab people in the back to get ahead in your job, well, you weren't left with many friendships. And so he says, if all you're trying to do is cling to this idea of who you need to be, you are eventually going to betray people in your life. You're going to betray who you were called to be. And at the end of it, you can't buy your soul back with that money any more than you can go out and buy a friend. You can't buy self-worth any more than you can go out and buy a good relationship. And he says, look, if all you're trying to do is save your life, you're going to lose that which really matters. And then the second half of verse 25, whoever loses their life for me will find it. I always thought that the it in that sentence, the find it, was finding your life. And I'm like, well, is this like one of those like mind games things? Like when I can't find my wallet, it's the moment I stop looking for it that it shows up. Like, is it one of? I always just assumed that's what he was talking about. We all understand that. We all lose our stuff, right? And that's how it works. The moment you're looking for another thing, how many people have been looking around their house for thing A and found things B through J, and thing A is nowhere to be found? I do that all the time. I'm looking for my wallet, and I find my keys, and I find that ticket from last week, and I find like that flashlight and that tool and this and that, but I never find what I'm looking for. I always assumed that that's what he was talking about. Like, well, as soon as I stop trying so hard to just find, what I'm trying to find in life, if I focus on Jesus, all of a sudden it'll be right there. But that's not exactly what he's talking about here. The it in that sentence goes back to verse 24. He's talking about the cross. And so look at the parallel of those two verses. He said, deny yourself and take up your cross. Because, and then in verse 25, whoever loses his life, denies himself, will find it, being the cross. So what Jesus says is, look, if you can deny yourself, because he says, I know you've got it. I know you've got this idea of what your life could or should or will be. I know you have this plan for what you're going to be, what you're going to do, what your life is going to look like. And he says, look, if you will just lose that, forget about it, deny it, set it aside, put it behind you, you will find, and in that, you will find my plan for your life. Let me give you an example of this. When people asked me what I was going to do with my life when I was in college, I went to college. I was a music major for 1 year, and then I switched to business marketing. I got a degree in marketing and management. And so people would ask me what I was going to do with my life, and I said, well, I would say, well, I'm going into ministry as a professional tither. That's what I told people. I said this to people, and I've said this. If you ever have heard me give my testimony, I was I didn't begin to understand that God had called me to ministry until afterwards. It wasn't a running from the call. This wasn't God called me to be a pastor when I was 15 and I said, no way, man, I want to do something else. I had no idea that this is what I was going to do with my life. And so I'm in college and I'm doing what I'm supposed to do and what, I feel like God has laid before me, and said, because in my mind, I didn't want to just be like, well, I'm going to make a lot of money because I'm greedy like that. So I said, I would jokingly say that I'm going to be a professional tither. That's going to be my ministry. And I genuinely thought that, hey, this is what God has called me to do, and I want to be used for God's kingdom, and the church does need money. The church needs people to support it and take care of it and be involved in it, and that's what I'm going to do with my life. And so I graduated from college with a degree in business. I graduated with college already having 3 or 4 years of relevant work experience. I got my first job pretty quick, and it was a local sales job, so I could hang out with my college friends and invest in them and start my career. And so things were going well. My first month or two of work, I was one of the top salespeople where I worked. I was doing well. And so all of a sudden, I get on my road, right? I graduate from college, and I see myself pulling onto this highway, right? I'm coming up the entrance ramp. There's like 4 lanes in front of me. It's well paved. It's smooth. I know exactly where I'm going. And so I get on the highway. I put my cruise control on. I get my feet up on the dash, even though you're not supposed to do that. And I am just ready to go, right? You know what I'm talking about? You guys, you go on a long trip. You set your cruise control. You're in it for the long haul. I get 5 minutes down the road. Jesus reaches over, pokes me in the ribs, and says, hey, this is your exit right here. I said, well, what do you mean my exit? What are you talking about, exit? My cruise control's on. We're on this highway. This is it. This is the plan. This is what you've got for me. This is where we're going. He says, no, your exit's right here. And I look at the exit coming up, and I say, that doesn't look like what we're supposed to be doing. That looks a lot different from where I thought I was going to be. And the short version of the story, I quit my job, I go back to school, I get a master's degree, and 3 years later, I find myself here as a senior pastor. Wasn't what I thought. That wasn't the road that I had, but Jesus said, here's your exit, this is your road. We're changing lanes now. And I got off. Probably would have been easier the other way. But that's not what God had for me. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who goes into business is denying God's call for their life. Like I said, I firmly still believe that I followed God's path for my life more, not that I didn't make any mistakes, but that was God's plan for me, was to go to school for business. God's plan for me was to get the education that I got and then change it and put me in a different direction. I believe that when I got on that highway, that's where God called me to go, but then he changed it. But see, what could have happened is I could have clung to that. I said, look, God, this is where you called me to be first, and I'm comfortable here. I've got the cruise on. I've got my snacks. I've got everything ready to go. I'm ready for this road. I'm ready. I'm equipped for it. I've got high mileage tires on the car, and that looks like a dirt road, and this car is front wheel drive, and I could have said all those things. So look, I'm equipped for this road. I'm ready for this road. I'm prepared for this road. I think I'm going to stay here. Because that's what we do. We cling to it. We try to hold on to it. We try to save it. And you know what he says to us in those moments? He says, look, my call, it's always an invitation. I'm always just suggesting that you take the exit. You always have the option to steer look, you're driving, you're steering the car, you can steer it wherever you choose to. And he says, look at and hear this. If you pass that exit, then I can't keep going with you. He says, look, my exit for you is here, my path for you is here, and that's the direction that I'm heading. And so if you want to keep going the way you want to go, if you want to keep clinging and try to save that life, you're going to have to do it by yourself. Think about this. Imagine if Jesus had left his path. What would his life have looked like? In the short term, it looks pretty good. I mean, in the short term, when we look at the story in the Gospels, maybe it would have been a bit better. I mean, that night with the disciples, when he broke the bread, he might have been like, he could have said, you know, Judas, I know they're paying you, I'll pay you even more if you keep your mouth shut. He said, Judas, I'll pay you even more if you point out some other guy. Go kiss Peter on the cheek. He could have said, Judas, he could have sat there and said, yep, we're going to the garden after dinner. Judas, go do what you're going to do, and then just booked it out of there. He could have headed for Egypt again. Remember, Jesus' parents fled to Egypt with him when he was a baby so he wouldn't die. He could have done the same thing. He could have fled, he could have left, he could have gone to another country, he could have saved his life. And man, the end of that week would have been a lot more comfortable for him. But that would have been the end of the story. Look what happened instead. Through his sacrifice, all of humanity received the ability to be forgiven. Through his sacrifice, God did amazing things. And when he was taken up to heaven, where he is now is radically different from where he was before. Think about the disciples. They could have done the same thing. Man, on the night that Jesus was crucified, they could have said, you know what, they said, we're out of here. They came back. They didn't have to do that. After Jesus taught them for those 40 days and he told them what was coming, they knew what was going to happen. He said, look, here's the road. Your disciples, I want you to be apostles. I want you to go. I want you to preach. I want you to be missionaries. I want you to go into all the world and preach my message. You're going to die for it. And almost all of them did. Almost all of the disciples were killed. Many of them crucified for their faith. They knew that was coming. Jesus was upfront about it. Right? He said, look, if you follow this road, you're going to die for it. You will die for me. And they said, yep. They said, bring it on. Because they remembered what he said here. They said, look, we can desert, we can try to save our lives, but we know that if we run away from your call, if we run away from this call to apostleship, then we're not going to be saving anything of value anyway. And if one of them had run away, when they got to the end of their life, when they lived in comfort, when they lived in safety and security, and they looked at what the other disciples had done, the miracles, the people that were changed, the lives that were changed, and people that were healed, they would have said, man, all I saved was a bunch of garbage. Because here's the final piece of the puzzle here. That God's road for us does lead through the dark places of the world. It does often mean that we will suffer. It means that we will be discouraged, that we will be attacked, that we're going to get dirty and messy as we wade through all of the junk that's in the world. It will be hard, but it also leads to Him. It leads to Christ. It leads to God's kingdom, and it leads to eternity. That when we get to the end of our lives here on earth, as tough and as hard as it's been, we know that everything that we have built will survive. We know that everything that we have done will continue. We will know that we have made an impact that goes beyond eternity. And that's what we seek. And that's what makes this all work. See, this isn't just God saying, look, I want you to come and be miserable for me. Who wants to sign up? Right? Often that's all we see. This isn't God just saying, look, I want you to come suffer for me just because. He says, look, I want you to come and join me in my work. And he says, my work is hard. People are going to puke all over you. People are going to get you sick. They're going to get you messy. People are going to mess up their lives. They're going to hurt you. Because when you go to help the hurting, when you go to hurt the broken, and help the sick, to make them well, to heal them, to help me change their lives, it's a dangerous place to go. But what you do will continue into eternity. He says in these verses, look, if you try to save your life, you might succeed. You might get everything you ever thought you wanted. But you're going to lose everything that matters. But look, if you would just get rid of your own plans and follow me to the cross, you will also follow me into glory and eternity, into permanent hope, permanent joy. and you will build something that will last.